Greetings to all participants in the course. My name is Santiago Guijarro Oporto. I'm a professor of New Testament at the Pontifical University of Salamanca, and I'm going to talk about the apostolic ministry in the early days of Christianity. This is a reflection that is part of a broader reflection, which is the reflection on the ministry, on its evolution, and on the changing forms that the ministry has acquired over time. When we look at the experience of the first Christian communities, we see that in all of them, and from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry, it became necessary to have community services. That is, there was a need to organize community life, and for this, it was necessary for some leaders to take special care of it. Already in the Gospels, we find some orientations that Jesus gives to his own followers when he sends them, because they are going to have a function with respect to the other followers. And in the same way, in the first Christian communities, different forms of ministerial service took place. These forms are varied. This is perhaps the most characteristic thing one encounters when approaching the writings of the New Testament, especially, but also other writings of early Christianity. It's the variety of forms with very different names. In communities of different kinds, we see different kinds of ministry. So it is very important to understand that in this initial moment, as far as the ministry is concerned, but also in what is concerned with other aspects of Christian life, there is a rehearsal-like situation. There's still no final definition. So when, for example, in pastoral letters we read about bishops or deacons, we cannot think that this configuration of that particular ministry is the same as the one that the ministry of bishops or deacons has acquired after 2,000 years. So we are in a period, let's say, of a lot of rehearsal, of a lot of variety in terms of external forms. And only in the middle of the 2nd century do we find a certain consensus regarding the structuring of what we know as the ministerial triad. That is, a triad configured by the bishops, priests, and deacons. Well, this would be a more phenomenological approach to the subject, more of an external observation. And I'm not going to talk about that because it seems to me that this aspect is more changeable. Those who are interested can turn to an excellent synthesis article recently written by Professor Romano Pena, in which you can find in the year 2021 of the journal Seminarias. It is an open online magazine, and therefore you can access it. Romano Pena, Ministries in the Church in the New Testament. There is, as I say, a fairly extensive article where there is a presentation of the different configurations. In this lesson, I would rather like to focus on some aspects that are kind of underlying all of these configurations. That is to say, what features do we find in the texts of the New Testament that are, as it were, defining and that have been recognized among the various essays that were then issued as, we would say, as worthy of being taken into account as normative and have been collected in the canon. And to do that, I am going to focus on a broad passage from the 2nd letter to the Corinthians, from chapter 2, verse 14 to chapter 7, verse 4. In this letter, which is probably the result of merging together different letters of Paul, we find these chapters that are in themselves a reflection on the apostolic ministry. And these are a reflection on the apostolic ministry that occurs in a very concrete situation, and that force them to go to the bottom of the question, to reflect on it, in which we can find some of the characteristics that are going to feature the Christian ministry. The Christian apostolic ministry defined with Christian traits, because it must be borne in mind that the models that the first Christian then had at their side were, on the one hand, Judaism, and on the other hand, were the religious mediators of the Hellenistic world. So we are going to give a little introduction and a la carte setting to situate ourselves. And then I like to go over the main features that define the apostolic ministry. To set the scene for this part of the second letter to the Corinthians, it will be enough with 2 or 3 brush strokes that help us understand what the situation is, the underlying motivation behind these chapters. The first thing to know is that, as I said before, it is very likely that these chapters constituted or were originally a standalone letter, a response to a particular problem that has arisen in the community. And how do we know this? Because in the very development of the letter, we see that there is an inconsistency between a cut that continues after chapter 7, verse 4, and on the other hand, the whole of these chapters of the letter has great coherence. But perhaps the most interesting thing is why this letter was written. And this letter was written because after having made the first proclamation of the gospel in Corinth, when Paul and his collaborators were in Ephesus, other missionaries came to the community proposing another way of living the ministry. So what we have in the letter is a dispute or a controversy about 2 ways of living the ministry. And this is very interesting because the Apostolic Church finally recognized that the proposal of Paul and his collaborators reflected the lifestyle of Jesus, and that is very important when it comes to evaluating it. Because what we find in it is, in some way, a reflection of what Jesus' proposal had been. So this independent letter, which responds to a concrete situation, has forced Paul, Silvanus, Timothy, the collaborators who make up the apostolic fraternity, to reflect on how they exercise the ministry and what is the deep meaning of that experience of the ministry. Thus we have a precious witness to what constitutes the essence of the apostolic ministry. This letter, which was integrated into the second letter to the Corinthians, has its structure, it has its organization, and perhaps the most interesting thing would be to read it right away. I'm going to read just a few pages, but continue reading, because that's how one gets a little bit of a grasp of the entire discourse. But it is also permissible to make a reading seeking for the threads that are woven internally by the discourse, and that allows us to see the fundamental features of the apostolic ministry. I think we can identify up to 5, which are the ones that I'm going to comment on. First, in this letter, in this text that I repeat of the second letter to the Corinthians from chapter 2, verse 14, where the Thanksgiving begins, to chapter 7, verse 4, where the last exhortation ends, the final exhortation. Second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 2, verse 14 through chapter 7, verse 4. I invite you to read this text immediately and see how it is indeed a reflection that has been carried out in the apostolic group. It is not only Paul's reflection on how to live the apostolic ministry. Well, in this letter on apostolic ministry, let's call it that, we find 5 features that are going to be defining of Christian ministry in all its changing forms and that are still relevant today. The first of these is that ministry is understood first and foremost as a service. This is the defining trait of the essence of ministry. Ministry is essentially a service, a diaconia. Let's explain what this term means and why he uses it. Secondly, ministry, as presented here by Paul and his collaborators, can only be experienced in union with Christ. And this union with Christ implies a profound knowledge, without which there is no possibility of living the Christian ministry. Thirdly, this would be the Christological dimension. Thirdly, ministry is at the service of the plan of the other, of God's plan. So we have to ask ourselves what that plan is and what is the attitude that requires the minister to put himself at the service of another's plan. This is its properly theological dimension. Fourthly, and this is mentioned often in the letter, the ministry reveals at the same time the weakness of the minister and the strength of the Spirit at work in him. It is the force that acts on weakness. This is the pneumatological dimension, we could say, of the ministry that is lived in a paradoxical context, in a paradoxical experience, because it combines weakness with the strength of the Spirit. And finally, the ministry is exercised within the framework of an ecclesial we, and also from a ministerial we. How do we reconcile this ecclesial we and the ministerial we? Notice that I'm saying a ministerial we, not a ministerial me. We'll talk about that later too. So 5 traits. Ministry is at its core a service, a diaconia. Ministry is lived in union with Christ. Ministry is in service of God's plan. Ministry is an experience of the Spirit in weakness and is ultimately exercised from a ministerial we, an apostolic we, in the context of an ecclesial we. I'm going to briefly comment on each of these traits because it seems to me that they constitute like the substratum of the experience of the ministry, or not only in the first hour but also afterwards. And it is therefore, I believe, some of the traits with which reflection on ministry and the experience of ministry can be confronted in all periods of history and therefore also in our own. The first trait is that ministry is first and foremost a service. I will briefly comment on how it appears in the letter and why. It is very striking that in this letter, in these chapters of the second letter to the Corinthians, when it comes to explaining, defending what the Christian ministry consists of and how it is defined in relation to other ways of living the ministry, Paul and his collaborators resort to the vocabulary of diaconia. Ministers are deacons and servants, and ministry is first and foremost a diaconia. This is very striking because in Paul's letters, he uses other terms. For example, he often uses the term apostolos, apostle, or apostolic ministry. Here he uses diaconia. Why? Because it has to define what the essence is, what distinguishes Christian ministry from other ministries. These words, diaconia and deacons, were common words in the ancient world. They were used to refer to one who had been tasked with an activity, and also for all those who performed a service. So why the use of this word? Why do they choose this terminology? Well, I think the explanation for this choice is that Jesus himself had defined himself as the diaconus. I am in your midst as the one who serves, as a deacon, as one who serves, as a servant, and he had defined his own ministry as a service. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to lay down his life for all. Therefore, this diaconia of Jesus, which he also entrusted to his disciple, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be the servant of all, is the root from which Paul and his collaborators define ministry as a service. So we can say that ministry is a service to the example of Jesus. It is the example of Jesus. It is the teaching of Jesus that defines ministry as a service. The second trait is that ministry is lived in union with Christ. This information appears repeatedly in the letter. I'm going to briefly read a passage in chapter 5, verses 14 to 17. For the love of Christ impels us, once we have come to the conviction that one died for all. Therefore, all have died. He indeed died for all, so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but him who for their sake died and was raised. Consequently, from now on we regard no one according to the flesh, even if we once knew Christ according to the flesh, yet now we know him so no longer. Here St. Paul speaks of two ways of knowing Christ, but above all, he speaks of a process in which one enters deeply into the knowledge of Christ. There is a human knowledge, a knowledge according to the flesh, and there is a knowledge according to the Spirit, or a knowledge according to the cross. Ministers of the gospel can only live their ministry in deep union with Christ. Cultivating this union with Christ is critical to making their ministry as a Christian ministry. The third trait is that ministers carry out their task in the service of God's plan. In the letter on the apostolic ministry, this plan is to restore the covenant, to bring about reconciliation, and that is why it is designated as the ministry of the new covenant and the ministry of reconciliation. In the end, the root of this understanding of ministry and the horizon of ministry is in the proclamation of Jesus, which is the coming of the reign of God. And this means that the ministers of the gospel do not carry out their own plan, but God's plan, and therefore must live in a constant attitude of obedience and seeking God's will. Fourthly, ministry is lived in the midst of a paradox in which our own weakness and God's strength are combined. There's a very expressive and well-known passage in the letter where this appears in a plastic way in chapter 4, verse 7. Now Paul and his collaborators say, because they speak in the plural, we carry this treasure in earthen vessels so that it may be seen that such an extraordinary force is from God and does not come from us. The letter enlists all the tribulations, all the difficulties, the same personal unworthiness that makes it a paradoxical experience, but at the same time, and this is very important, there is also the experience of the strength of the Spirit, that is, the weakness of the minister. His sin, his dignity must also be lived in the midst of this experience, opening up the possibility of the action of the Spirit of God. And finally, in the letter, it is very clear how this ministerial we is situated within the ecclesial we. And there is a paradigm shift with respect to what we usually understand. We spontaneously understand that the minister acts personally with respect to a community that is the ecclesial we. The model that appears here in the letter is very different. The ecclesial we also includes ministers. That is, ministers are part of that ecclesial we. And on the other hand, they exercise the ministry from a ministerial we. That is, from an apostolic fraternity that acts as part of that ecclesial we, and that has a mission, a task, with respect to the rest of the community. The letter on ministry, as you can see, does not offer a complete vision, but it presents some of the fundamental traits. We can say that the apostolic ministry is first and foremost a service that is lived in a close relationship with Jesus at the service of God's plan in the midst of witness, but with the strength of the Spirit. It is a divine commission that we have received and that we carry out together with others in the heart of the church.